The wagon road below Coyle's Crossing had carried freight for 19 years before anyone learned what lay beneath it, and the woman who learned it first arrived in the autumn of 1887 with $4, a borrowed mule, and a set of stonemason's tools that had belonged to a dead man. She was 28 years old. She had been put out of a house that was never truly hers, told to take only what she could carry, and she had carried the tools because they were the one thing in the world she knew how to use. What she did not yet know was that the road she walked, the ordinary rutted road every freighter cursed for its soft shoulder and its sinking center, hid a stone chamber that had been sealed since before the war, and that the contents of that chamber would settle a debt the whole valley had agreed to forget. This is a story about a thing that was buried in plain sight under the wheels of every man who passed and never looked down. Stay with it, because what she found was not gold, and it mattered more than gold. Her name was Hannah Mercer. She had come to the Bitterroot country of western Montana 3 years before, the wife of a man named Elias Drew, and when Elias died of a lung fever in the second winter, his brother took the homestead, the stock, and the standing she had spent those years earning. The brother was not cruel in the way men in stories are cruel. He was cruel in the manner of a ledger. He showed her the marriage had left no issue, the deed bore only his family's name, and the law, as he read it, gave her nothing. He let her keep her clothes and the tools her own father had left her, and he had a hand drive her to the edge of the property and set her down at the fork where the wagon road met the river trace, and that was the whole of it. She did not weep where the hand could see her. She had learned that much from her father, who used to say that a person who showed a stranger where it hurt was only teaching the stranger where to press. She watched the wagon go, and then she shouldered the canvas roll of tools and walked down the road toward the only place within a day's reach where a woman alone might find honest work, a freight stop and clutch of buildings the maps called Coyle's Crossing. The roll was heavy on her shoulder, and she did not set it down once in the 8 miles. Inside it were the things her father had pressed into her keeping when his hands could no longer hold them: a set of chisels in graded sizes wrapped in oiled flannel, a wooden mallet worn pale where his palm had ridden it, a steel square, a plumb bob on a waxed cord, and the 12-pound striking sledge that had been his father's before him. The brother had let her keep them because he saw cold iron and dead weight. He had not seen that he was handing her the only inheritance in that house that could not be taken back by reading a deed aloud, the knowledge in her own 2 hands which no law touched and no man could sign away. She walked, and the river ran beside the road, and she made herself a promise that she would not beg whatever came. A person who begs, her father had said, teaches the world she has nothing. A person who works teaches it otherwise. Her father had been a stonemason in Pennsylvania, and before he died, he had taught her everything his hands knew. He had taught her to read the grain of a block the way other men read print, to know by the ring of a chisel whether the stone beneath would split true or shatter, to lay a course so level that water would stand on it without running. He used to set her palm flat against a wall he had built and tell her to feel for the lie in it. "There is no lie in this one," he would say. "A wall tells the truth or it falls down." She had been 14 when he died, and the tools had come to her because her brothers wanted the shop and the money and thought a satchel of cold iron beneath their notice. They had been wrong about the iron, as men so often were about the things they could not be bothered to understand. Coyle's Crossing in those years was not a town so much as a habit the freight road had fallen into. There was a long, low station house where teams were changed and stabled, a store, a smithy, a boarding house run by a widow named Orpha Sallows, and a scatter of cabins where the men who worked the road slept between hauls. The road itself was the only reason any of it stood. Wagons came down out of the high country loaded with ore and timber and went back up, loaded with flour and tools and whatever the catalogs promised, and every one of them passed over the soft place in the road at the bottom of the grade, the place the freighters called the Sink. Hannah reached the crossing near dark and asked at the boarding house for work and a bed. Orpha Sallows looked her over the way a woman looks over another woman who has plainly been turned out, with neither pity nor contempt, but a kind of grim recognition, and said there was no work for a woman with no kitchen skills and no money, but she could sleep in the lean-to off the wash-house for the labor of hauling water until she found somewhere to go. Hannah said that would do. She set her tools in the corner of the lean-to where she could see them from the cot, and she lay down hungry. And she did not let herself think past the morning. The morning brought the first of the men who would underestimate her, and there would be many. His name was Del Furlong, and he ran the freight station for the company that owned it, a man with a soft, heavy face and the manner of someone who had never in his life been told no by anyone who could not afford to say it twice. He found her hauling water and asked what she meant to do with herself. And when she said she was a mason and would take stonework if any was to be had, he laughed. It was not a hard laugh, it was worse than hard. It was the easy, comfortable laugh of a man who has decided a thing is funny and does not need to check whether it is true. "A mason," he said. "And I suppose you shoe horses and assay silver in your spare hours?" He told the smith about it, and the smith told the teamsters, and by noon the joke had gone up and down the road, the woman at Sallows's place who said she was a stonemason, and the men laughed and meant no great harm by it, and did not think of her again. Hannah heard the laughter, and folded it away and said nothing. Her father had taught her that too. "Let them measure you short," he said. "It costs them more than it costs you. A man who thinks you cannot lift the stone will not watch where you set it." She had been at the crossing 11 days when the road gave way. It happened under a heavy ore wagon coming down the grade, the near front wheel dropping suddenly through the surface of the sink as though the ground had simply decided to stop being ground. The wagon lurched. The team screamed. A teamster named Reuben Sachs was thrown clear into the brush with nothing worse than a wrenched shoulder. And when the dust settled, the wheel had sunk to the hub in a hole that had not been there an hour before. The men gathered to curse it. The sink had always been soft, they said. It needed filling again, as it had needed filling every few years since anyone could remember. Load after load of gravel poured in and swallowed and gone. Del Furlong came down from the station and looked at the hole and said to bring gravel and fill it. And that was the whole of his thinking on the matter. Hannah, drawn down to the road with the rest, did not look at the hole the way the men looked at it. She looked at the edge of it where the wagon wheel had sheared away the packed surface, and she saw something the men did not have the eyes to see. She saw a line. A straight line, mortared, the edge of dressed stone, cut and laid by a hand that had known what it was doing, and curving away into the dark beneath the road where no straight mortared line had any business being. She did not say anything. She had learned the price of saying things. She came back that night, though, with a lantern, when the road was empty and the men were in their cups at the station, and she knelt at the edge of the broken sink and brushed the loose gravel away with her hands, and what she uncovered made her sit back on her heels in the cold and go very still. It was an arch, a low stone arch, the keystone wedged true, the voussoirs laid in a curve so clean it could only have been the work of a mason who loved the work, and it had been built to span something. A chamber. The gravel that the freighters had poured into the sink for 19 years had not been filling a soft spot in the road. It had been falling through a crack in the crown of a buried vault, swallowed into a space below, which was why the road sank again no matter how much they poured, because they were trying to fill a room the size of a cabin, one wheelbarrow at a time, and never knew it. Souse. What she did not yet know was who had built it, or why, or what waited inside the air. That had been sealed under the road since before she was born, she told no one. In the morning, she went to Orpha Sallows and asked, as though it were idle, how old the road was and who had laid it. Orpha said the road was older than the crossing, that it had been a military freight route before the war between the states, graded by the army to move supplies to a post that was abandoned before it was ever finished. There had been a man, Orpha said, a sergeant of engineers who stayed behind when the post was given up, a stonemason by trade who had married a local woman and worked the valley until he died. Coyle, his name was. The crossing took its name from him. He built half the foundations in the country, Orpha said, and the church, and the dam at the mill, and folks said he could lay a stone so it would not move in 100 years. Then the fever took him and his wife both in one bad winter, and they had no children that lived, and that was a long time ago. Coyle. The mason who built so true his walls would outlast the men who forgot him. Hannah understood then that she had found his work, and that he had built the chamber under the road for a reason, and that the reason had died with him because he had not lived to tell it. She went to Del Furlong and made him an offer. She would repair the sink. She said repair it so it would never need filling again, for the right to whatever fill had been lost into it over the years, and the use of the station's tools and a teamster's day wage while the work lasted. Furlong thought it the easiest bargain he had ever struck. The sink had cost the company gravel and time for 2 decades. If the fool woman wanted to dig in it and call herself a mason, let her, and if she failed, he had lost nothing but a few days of a wage he could dock from her board. He had a paper drawn up at the store, the kind of paper a man writes when he is certain he is getting the better of it, granting Hannah Mercer the contents of the road cut at the sink and the right to effect repairs, and he signed it without reading it twice, and the storekeeper witnessed it, and Furlong went back up to the station laughing again. That paper, signed in idle contempt, was the lever that would move the whole valley. Hannah did not know that yet either. She knew only that she had bought the right to open Coyle's chamber, and that she had perhaps 3 days before. The men grew curious about how slowly the fool woman was filling a simple hole. She began at first light. She would not let the teamsters help, telling Furlong she worked alone, or not at all, and the truth beneath the refusal was that she could not let anyone else see the arch until she understood what it guarded. She set a barrier of trestles around the cut, and she went down into it with her father's tools, and she began to take the chamber apart the way her father had taught her to take anything apart, slowly, reading each stone before she moved it, learning the building by unbuilding it. The work was harder than anything she had done. The crown of the vault had cracked under 19 years of wagon weight, and the broken stones were wedged and bound, each one holding the next, so that a single careless pull might bring the whole road down into the chamber and her with it. She learned the load of it with her hands. She found the stones that carried weight and the stones that only seemed to, and she shored, as she went with timber begged from the smith, and she lifted out the keystone of the cracked span with a block and tackle rigged to a tripod of freight poles, and lowered it aside, and looked down into the dark her lantern could not yet fill. The first day she did nothing but clear. She lifted out the gravel the freighters had poured in across 2 decades, basket by basket hauling it up the slope on the windlass and dumping it clear of the cut, and by dusk her palms had blistered through the calluses her father's tools had given her years before, and she had moved perhaps 1/3 of the fill, and she had learned the first lesson the chamber meant to teach her, which was patience. She wrapped her hands in strips torn from her one spare shift and went back down. The second day she found the true edge of the crack, the place where the road's weight had broken Coyle's crown, and she saw how the failure had run, how one stone settling had thrown its load onto the next, until the whole span sagged, and she understood that she could not simply pull the broken stones free. She would have to take the arch down in the order opposite to the order. Man would build it, the last stone first, the keystone before the springers, reading the thrust of it backward. Her father's voice came to her as she worked, not as a haunting, but as a habit of thought worn so deep it spoke in his words. An arch is a quarrel between stones that never ends, he used to say, each one pushing on the next, and the whole of it standing, because not one of them can win. Take it apart wrong, and you let one win, and then they all come down. She set her shoring under the soundstones, and she eased the broken ones free one at a time, and when a great cracked voussoir hung at last in the tackle and swung clear, she stood in the cut breathing hard with the cold sweat stinging her wrapped hands, and below her the dark of the chamber breathed up at her, and she knew she was nearly through. Cold air came up out of the chamber to meet her. Air that had been shut away from the sun for 30 years and more, dry and still and smelling of stone and old iron and something faintly of tallow. She lowered the lantern on its cord and watched the light spread across a floor no living person had stood on since Coil sealed it. The chamber was the size of a small room, dry-laid and corbel-roofed. The walls so true that even now, after all those years and all that weight, they stood without a stone out of place. And against the far wall, ranked on stone shelves Coil had built into the masonry, stood the thing he had hidden. It was a granary, or it had been built as one. The shelves, though, did not hold grain. They held the records of the valley. Hannah went down on the rigged ladder with the lantern and stood among them, and slowly, as the light reached into the corners, she understood what Coil had done. There were strong boxes of cedar and iron, 24 of them, each one marked with a family's name, burned into the lid. There were ledgers wrapped in oilcloth. There were deeds and survey plats rolled in tin tubes sealed with wax. And there were ordinary things, a christening gown folded in paper, a daguerreotype in a velvet case, a fiddle in a canvas bag, a child's carved horse, the keepsakes a community leaves with the one man it trusts to keep them safe. Coil had not built a vault to hide treasure. He had built a strong room for the people of a frontier, with no bank, no courthouse, no safe place for the things that proved who they were and what was theirs. And then the fever had taken him before he could tell anyone where it was, and the valley had gone on for 30 years over the top of its own buried memory, pouring gravel into the crack, and never knowing. She moved among the shelves with the lantern held high, and she read the burned names one by one in the wavering light. Sallows, Vela, Brunt. Coil's own hand had cut each letter into the cedar with a hot iron, deep and square and unhurried, the lettering of a man who built words the way he built walls, to stand. The boxes were not stacked carelessly. They were ranked by some order she did not yet understand, and the floor before them had been swept smooth before it was sealed, and a stub of tallow candle still stood in an iron holder by the ladder foot where Coil had set it the last time he climbed out, 30 years and more before, meaning to climb down again and never doing it. The candle had burned perhaps an inch. She looked at that unburned candle a long while. It told her better than any ledger could that the man had not known he was leaving for the last time. He had meant to come back. The fever had decided otherwise, and the work he loved had kept its faith with him in the dark across 3 decades, waiting for a hand that knew what it was looking at. She knelt on the cold floor among the boxes, and she did not touch them at first. She understood that she was the first person in 3 decades to breathe that air, and the understanding made her careful in a way that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the dead man whose work surrounded her. There is no lie in this one, her father had said of a true wall. Coil's chamber had told the truth for 30 years to no one. Now it was telling it to her. What she did not yet know was that one of those burned names on those cedar lids would be the name of the family that had cast her out, and that what was sealed in their box would unmake the cruelty done to her, not with a confrontation, but with a single sheet of paper Coil had kept safe in the dark. She brought up the ledgers first, the wrapped books, because a mason's daughter knew that the building of a thing is written down before it is built, and that whatever Coil had been keeping he would have kept an account of it. She carried them to the lean-to under cover of dark, and she read by the lantern through the night, and what the ledgers held was the whole history of the valley's trust. Coil had recorded every box brought to him, every deed laid up, every loan made between neighbors with no bank to witness it, every parcel of land whose true ownership had been entrusted to his keeping because his word and his lockbox were the nearest thing the country had to a court. He had written it all in a clean engineer's hand, dated and witnessed, and he had meant for it to be found because on the first page he had written a line Hannah read 3 times before she could go on. The lean-to was cold and the lantern was poor, and she read until her eyes ached and the oil ran low, turning the brittle pages with the care she would have given a stone she meant to split. Some entries were a single line, a neighbor leaving a deed before riding north for the season. Some ran to a page, the careful division of a dead man's land among children too young to hold it, set down so that no one could later cheat them of their portions. There were widows in those pages who had laid up the only proof they had of what their husbands left them. There were 2 homesteaders, Brant and a man whose name had faded, who had brought Coyle the same disputed survey and asked him to hold both their claims until a judge could be found to settle which line was true, and Coyle had taken both and written that he held them in trust for whichever the law should favor, and had judged nothing himself, because it was not his to judge. The trust of a whole frontier was in that book, the trust of people who had nothing to secure their lives with but the honesty of one man who built true. Hannah understood, reading it, why the chamber had been built so strong. Coyle had not been guarding things. He had been guarding faith. To whoever opens this room, he had written, these things were left in my trust and are not mine and were never mine. Restore them to their people. A wall tells the truth, or it falls down. She sat a long while with that. The words were so near to her father's words that for a moment the 2 dead men, the Mason of Pennsylvania and the Mason of Montana, seemed to be the same man speaking to her across the years, telling her the same thing they had told their stone. Do the work, true. Let it outlast you. She folded the ledger shut, and she knew what the chamber was for, and she knew it was not for her. The complication came 3 mornings on, when Del Furlong grew tired of waiting, and came down to the sink to see why the fool woman had not finished filling a hole. He found the trestle barrier and the tripod and the windlass, and he found Hannah at the edge of the cut, and he found, when he pushed past her and looked down, the opened arch and the lantern light and the rank boxes below, and his soft face changed. He was not a stupid man, only an incurious one, and incuriosity falls away fast when a man sees property he did not know existed. Those boxes, he said, what is in them? And Hannah, who had known this moment would come and had decided how she would meet it, said only that they were records left in trust by the man who built the road, and that they belonged to the families whose names were on them. Furlong did not hear the second half of that sentence. He heard records. He heard deeds. He was a company man, and the company had spent 20 years freighting over this valley and buying up the parcels of families who could not prove their claims when the survey came through, families whose original deeds had been lost. They always said, lost in a fire or a flood or simply never properly filed, so that the land reverted and the company bought it cheap at the territorial sales. Furlong looked down into Coyle's chamber, and he understood, faster than Hannah would have credited him, that the lost deeds had not been lost at all. They had been laid up safe in the dark under the very road the company drove its wagons down, and if they came to light, every cheap parcel the company held on a clouded title would be clouded no longer, and the cloud would fall on the company. He told her the boxes were on company land and were company property under the paper she had signed. Hannah took the paper from inside her dress, the paper Furlong himself had drawn in contempt, and she read it back to him in the flat voice her father had used for reading a wall. The paper granted her the contents of the road cut at the sink, the contents. Furlong had written it himself, certain he was giving away nothing but gravel, and he had granted her, in his own hand and his own witnessed signature, everything in Coyle's chamber. He went white, and then red, and he said a paper could be undone, and he went up the grade faster than a heavy man should move, and Hannah understood that the quiet part of the story was over, and that she had until he reached a telegraph and a company lawyer to do what Coyle had asked her to do. She did not run. Running was what the company expected of people with no standing. Instead, she did the one thing the company could not undo, which was to give the valley back its own memory faster than any lawyer could seal it away again. She went first to Orpha Sallows because Orpha knew every family in the country, and because a thing carried by women in a frontier valley travels faster than any wire. She showed Orpha the ledger and the line on the first page, and she read out the names burned into the cedar lids, and Orpha sat down hard in her own kitchen chair when Hannah read the name Sallows, because there was a box with her dead husband's name on it, and in it, when they brought it up that afternoon, was the deed to the boarding house and the 400 acres behind it that Orpha had worked for 19 years, believing she held only by the company's sufferance, never knowing her husband had laid the true deed up with Coyle for safekeeping the year before he died. The word went out from Orpha's kitchen the way water goes out when a dam fails, not in a flood but in 1,000 small channels all at once. By the next morning there were families camped along the road, the descendants and the survivors of every name Coyle had burned into a lid, and Hannah brought the boxes up out of the chamber, one at a time, and she did not open them, because they were not hers to open. She read the name on each lid aloud, and she put it into the hands of whoever answered to that name, and she made each of them sign Coyle's ledger beside the original entry, restored in her own clean hand that she had learned from her father, so that the record would show the trust had been kept. There was an old man named Tomas Vela who took the box with his family's name and opened it on the road with hands that shook, and found inside the survey plat of a parcel along the river that the company had taken for taxes 30 years before on the claim that no deed existed. The deed existed. It had been 6 feet under the company's own wagons the whole time. Tomas Vela held it up to the light, and he did not shout, and he did not weep. He looked at Hannah, and he said, in the careful English of a man who had learned it late, that his father had told him on his deathbed that the land was theirs, and the proof was kept safe, and that no one had ever believed him. Now there is proof, he said, and Hannah said there was always proof. It was only waiting for a true hand to bring it up. The old man stood in the road with the plat in his 2 hands, and turned slowly to look toward the river, toward the bench of bottomland the company had run cattle on for 30 years, and Hannah watched his face and saw a thing she would remember the rest of her life. He was not looking at land. He was looking at his father, vindicated at last an old wrong his father had carried to the grave, lifted off the man's memory by a sheet of paper kept dry in the dark. He folded the plat along its old creases, careful not to crack it, and he put it inside his coat, against his heart, and he asked her, quietly, whether he might be the one to carry the news to his sister down the valley, who had stopped speaking of the land years ago because the speaking only brought her grief. Hannah said the proof was his to carry wherever he chose. He nodded once and walked to his horse, and he did not look small any more. The box with the name of the family that had cast her out came up near the last. She had seen the name on the lid days before and had said nothing, and she brought it up and read it aloud like all the others, drew, and the man who answered to it was the brother who had set her down at the fork with $4. He had come like the rest, summoned by the word that the lost deeds were surfacing, certain that whatever lay in a box with his name on it would only add to what he held. Hannah put the box in his hands and made him sign the ledger, and she watched him open it, and she watched his face as he understood what his own grandfather had laid up with Coyle and never told his sons. It was the original homestead deed. And it was made out in the witnessed hand of 30 years before, not to the Drew family alone, but jointly, to the holder and to the holder's heirs, and to any spouse of the same who should survive him and keep the land in use. Coyle had recorded it because Coyle recorded everything true. The brother had read the law to Hannah as he wished it to read, that a widow without issue took nothing. The land his family held, however, had carried from the very beginning a condition his grandfather had set, and the company had been glad to see lost: that a surviving spouse who worked the land held a right in it that no brother could sign away. Elias had worked that land with Hannah for 3 years. By the deed in her dead husband's grandfather's own hand, the part of it she had built with her own labor had been hers all along. She did not gloat. She had been taught better, and besides, the deed did the speaking, and a deed in a witness ledger speaks in a voice no lawyer drowns out. The brother looked at the paper and looked at her, and found he had nothing to say that the ledger had not already answered. He did not give it back to her in that moment with grace. Men like that rarely do. Within the season, though, the territorial recorder had entered Coyle's ledger as the lost trust record it plainly was. Every restored deed filed against it, and the company's clouded titles fell one after another like a wall built false, and the brother held the homestead only on the terms his own grandfather had set. With Hannah's worked portion deeded out to her, and there was nothing in any law he could read to undo it. Del Furlong's telegraph and his company lawyer arrived too late to matter, which is how it almost always goes when the truth is given to the people it belongs to before the powerful can lock it up again. A lawyer can challenge a deed held by one widow. He cannot easily challenge 30 deeds restored at once to 30 families, with the original witnessed record entered in the public books and the whole valley standing witness. The company did not fight it in the end. A company is a kind of wall, too, and it will not spend itself defending a foundation it knows to be false. Furlong was moved to another district. The valley does not remember him, which is the only punishment a man like that truly suffers, to be made small and then forgotten. What the valley remembered was the chamber and the woman who opened it. Hannah did not grow rich. She had restored every box to its family and taken nothing from any of them but the one deed that the law and her own dead husband's grandfather agreed was hers, a portion of land along the river with a stand of cottonwood and a spring. She repaired the sink as she had promised, and she repaired it true, rebuilding Coyle's cracked vault into a sound foundation and bridging the road over it with a stone span of her own laying, dressed and keyed so clean that the freighters who had cursed the soft spot for 20 years drove over it without a jolt and never knew what they crossed. She set the keystone of her own arch with her father's chisel, the worn handle smooth in her palm, and she cut no name into it, because Coyle had cut no name into his, and she understood by then that the truest work does not sign itself. The men who had laughed did not come to her with apologies, because men who laugh easily are seldom built for apologies, but they came in other ways. The smith began to send her the stonework he could not do. Reuben Sachs, the teamster who had been thrown when the road gave way, brought his daughter to learn the trade because, he said, he had seen what a woman with a chisel could do and would not have his girl told she could not. Orpha Sallows, secure at last in her own 400 acres, gave Hannah the use of a cabin and a field for as long as she wanted it, which turned out to be the rest of her life. She lived in the Bitterroot country for 40 years more. She built foundations and chimneys and a schoolhouse and the stone bridge at the mill that replaced Coyle's old timber one, and she trained 4 apprentices, 3 of them women, and when the railroad finally came up the valley and the freight road fell quiet, the one stretch of it that never sank, never cracked, and never needed work was the span she had laid over Coyle's chamber. Engineers came to look at it and could not understand how a road built so long ago held so true. An old woman in the valley could have told them. She had laid it the way her father taught her, and the way Coyle had built before them, both reading the stone, trusting the work, cutting no name, letting the truth carry the weight. She died in the spring of 1927, past 70, in the cabin Orpha had given her, and they buried her on the river parcel that had been hers by a deed kept safe in the dark for 30 years and brought up by her own hands. The granddaughter of Tomas Vela, whose family deed had been the first one Hannah lifted from the chamber, laid the headstone, a plain block of valley granite dressed true, and on it she cut no flowery word, only the name and the years, and beneath them a line the old woman had said often enough that the whole valley knew it. A wall tells the truth, or it falls down. The chamber is still there, under the road below Coyle's Crossing, empty now of everything but the cold, dry air, and the stone shelves and the clean curve of two masons' arches, the dead man's and the woman's, holding up the weight of the road above as they have held it for a century and more. Nobody pours gravel into the sink anymore. There is no sink. There is only the truth, laid up safe and then given back, and the road that runs true over the top of it, and the long quiet proof that the thing the world drives over and never looks at may be the very thing that holds everything up. Did you ever wonder what might be buried under the roads you have traveled all your life and never thought to look beneath? Tell me what you would hope was waiting there. And if a story of something hidden and then brought back into the light is the kind of thing that stays with you, there is another one waiting, about a woman and a thing the world threw away, just past the end of this road.